We actually have some time for debate now. Now I see almost every hand in the room up, which says something about this topic. If the audience will indulge me for just 1 minute, as chair, since I'm holding the microphone, I'm going to ask just one first question, and then we will open it up to the audience. And I want to ask this question because it was teed up by the previous panel, and it relates to my exam question. We have these two views on growth. I'm making a cartoon example, but we have what could be called the green growth camp that says that with the right policy tools, if we did everything that Hal and Gernot and others and Seth said we should do, we can decouple growth and emissions, transform our technologies, create a new industrial revolution, a new model of growth. There's what Peter Victor talked about earlier today and his colleague Tim Jackson saying, no, you guys are dreaming. Growth itself is the problem. And we need to slow or stop growth, particularly in developed countries, redistribute to developing countries, and redefine our economy in terms of consumption, status, freedom, and so on, and move to a kind of post-materialist society. That's a pretty profound debate. And given the different perspectives, I would love to just have a brief comment from each of our panelists on it. And if you tend toward one camp or the other, I'd like a little comment on why you think it's actually achievable. Or maybe the answer is none and we're screwed. But let's start with you, Seth.
Yeah. Just to clarify, I don't think I didn't mean to say that I thought that we could pull it off with growth. What I was saying was, I didn't think that's how we should sell it. I don't think we should, for me, the question of growth, or degrowth isn't a policy, it's an outcome. And we just don't know, that's my point. In terms of whether or not it can be accomplished with decoupling. I just don't know. I think the GDP equation is going to look really different. I think for sure we're talking about deconsumption and that piece of it. And I'm pretty sure we're looking at a significant increase in G. And what the net effect's going to be, I really just don't know. I do think, and I guess this is a caution with some of what we've heard, I think we need to be wary of a Jevons effect, where if we're just focusing on carbon intensity and improving efficiency, but not tackling income inequality and overconsumption, then all that activity is just going to go somewhere else. And that's why I think we actually need hard caps on the resources that we want and the emissions. And I think we need, on the inequality front, to be liberating some people of their disposable income.
I'm not sure the choice is quite as stark as you made out, Eric, but I do think that either way, a massive economic structural shift is required. I don't think that the challenge vanishes if you move to a zero growth paradigm. It's still very hard. And in fact, I would argue that if you lose growth, it's probably even harder because you end up with your society focused, as we've seen with the financial crisis. I mean, it took the wind out of a lot of good momentum and progress that was occurring on environmental fronts because people turned their attention to getting their economies growing again. I think Seth's right to say that the growth rate of any particular economy is kind of an outcome. It's an outcome that I think as we get further into the literature on happiness and then into Amartya's work on flourishing, etc., we will see as second order. But it's still, it's still important. And I think my sense is that to get through this structural transition, we're going to need a lot of innovation, a lot of human intellect, and probably that's going to be correlated with a flourishing in the box that I put outside the constrained material ecosystem. And with any luck, that will generate some growth for even in the developed world.
I have to make 3 points if you ask the question that way. Keynes wrote an essay, Economics for Our Grandchildren, where he says, of course, our grandchildren will look at economics as a pretty unimportant, useful, necessary, but boring subject, because the economic problems will have been solved. We are getting closer. You showed the graph. 1/3 took off a couple of centuries ago. 1/3 is catching up right now, and the last third, no way, will accept being left behind. I'm not going to put a precise date on it, but let's say 100 years from now, I see absolutely no reason why what we call growth today should be meaningful to people. However, Keynes was aware of the fact that if an economy is really to work as a competitive market system, and he didn't believe in a planned economy, and I think he was right not to believe in it, if it's to work, then you need to design a financial system where the rate of interest fluctuates around 0. He made suggestions, he explained how to do it. And you need an industrial system where rates of returns fluctuate around 0. Now, that's pretty massive stuff, and frankly, it's for later. My second point, this little watch I bought from a young fellow selling illegally stuff on the streets on Hackescher Markt. He was good looking, he was clearly smart, he was not well fed. I asked, where do you come from? He said, from Latvia. I said, how do you feel here? He said, very happy because I made it. I say, what did you do in Latvia? He says, I was studying physics. We are doing this to 1/3 of the European youth right now. And I find it extremely hard to stay in the Adlon and enjoy myself, which I do. And the only reason why I'm not ashamed is that I try at least to help to get out of this situation, which I find shameful. And I come from one of the richest countries in the world, which is Switzerland. Today, in Europe and on this planet, to seriously advocate whatever economic policy without paying attention, number one, to employment, is, in my opinion, immoral. GDP is treated today as a measure of happiness, which is stupid, silly, idiotic. GDP was introduced by Keynes, and I'm not a Keynesian, but that's for another conversation. GDP was introduced only, solely, as an indicator to create full employment, and that's it. So whoever creates full employment in Latvia without increasing GDP, welcome, as you say, no problem. But whoever is willing to keep losing 1/3 of Europe's youth now, and more than 1/3 of the planetary youth, in my opinion, should stay out of this debate. If we accept this challenge, can we, in the short term of, say, 20 years or something like that, achieve reasonable employment numbers, give a sense of purpose and hope to youth, while decreasing emission? I'm not saying for 500 years, I'm saying for 20 years. I've done the numbers, I'm willing to share them with everybody. The answer is yes. So right now, the problem is clearly how to offer a prospect for not only, but mainly the young people in a way which is compatible with what we are doing. And what I try to say, and I really mean it, is that under each and every major economic model used today, including the national energy modeling system of the US, including what the European Central Bank uses, includes what my friend Werner Röger does with ECFIN in Brussels, all these models have the structure that I showed with old economic thinking. By constructions, these models make you unable to achieve full employment, reasonable growth in order to have full employment and reduce emission. We've got to change that. That's one of the professional responsibility for people like us. Sorry for taking the time, but the question is not one for yes or no.
Two quick points, and I guess both to echo Cameron and Carlo as well. Growth is an outcome, not something for a policy. Well, to target, yes, but it is not a policy per se. Right. So this is, I guess, yet again an argument for policy incrementalism. in the sense, right? Whether this is house building codes or gas taxes or anything in between, or absolute caps on CO2 emissions. It's the incremental policy step that matters most, not the philosophical debate on where we ought to be 50 or 100 years from now. Right? The fact that CO2 emissions ought to go the way of child labor is pretty clear. But saying it so won't make it so. Banning CO2 is not an option. We need other incremental policy tools to do so. Second quick point, I guess, right, if I was a betting person, will we make it? Well, if we don't, there's no one left to take the bet, so absolutely.
I was going to answer yes or no, but I can't decide which. You know, the point that people have been making here is crucial, that we need to design economies around quality of life, around happiness, gross domestic happiness, or what have you. And I think that entails quality and equality. A lot's been said about equality. Let me say just a couple things about quality. Riding a bicycle around Berlin, you see all kinds of interesting things happening. There's designs, there's arts. The buildings are just gorgeous. People are investing in the $50 play, not the $5 play. And I think that's part of the new economic paradigm. Let me just add two little points. The Chinese use a term I like. It's called the circular economy. They don't say growth or not growth. They understand at the top levels, though not out in all the provinces, that they cannot manage a nation of 1.4 billion people based on exogenous growth. It has to come from endogenous growth, different kind of growth. One other realm that demands some creativity and thought is we have to not only build a new economy, we have to disassemble the old economy. And that's a kind of recycling. But old houses have to be retrofitted, old factories have to be torn down and replaced with new things and so on. And there are very few cultures that are good at that. I mean, the United States kind of has a disposal economy when we get tired of stuff, but when it's working, we amortize the crap out of it. You know, the average power plant in America is more than 30 years old, and a third of them came from when Khrushchev was in power or before, right? They're still working. Let's keep them around. So in fact, the only economy that I know about that has actually specifically targets old stuff and shuts it down is the Chinese economy, and what they achieve there, they perhaps negatively compensate for in the lack of democracy that entails that. But that's one of the things we have to think about as well.
Right. Okay, well, the whole room shout their question at once, and then we'll. So I'm gonna be as democratic as possible, or I go in the order I saw the hands. I'm gonna take 3 questions. I'm gonna ask everyone to be quick because there are so many questions. The gentleman in the necktie in the middle, right in the one row back, right in the middle of the room. And then this lady over here, and then Richard. I'll take those 3, and then we'll do a quick round, and then come back. No, sorry, it was. Did you have you had your hand up first? Yeah. You were the quickest out of the box.
Oh, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Look, obviously my remarks this morning triggered some interest. Well, I'm delighted at that. But I want to say that I think moderator is trying to create more of a division than is really warranted. I heard a lot of things from the panelists with which I agree, but there are some things that I might take a little different position on. If I may take a moment to say so, because you sort of characterized my position and Tim's and said, well, there's that position. It sounded pretty bleak, and then there are all these smart guys here who've got the answer to get us out of the trap. I'm with those who say that the real problem is reducing the impact that we're having on the biosphere. It's not just a carbon problem, though, which is one of the shortcomings of this session. Not our fault, but it's a much bigger problem than just carbon. So that's the first thing I would say. I agree very much with Seth and others who then agreed with him that, that growth is an outcome. I agree with that. However, I've had a lot of experience in policy, and as others must know here, that growth is often used as a test. In other words, you propose the creation of a new park, you propose a new air pollution law, and what they want to know is, what's it going to do to growth, or competitiveness, or productivity? In other words, it's a hurdle which all of the measures that you think are important and can be effective are tested against. Hence, I thought it was really important to see whether an advanced economy, not the poor economies, but an advanced economy like Canada, could in fact achieve a whole range of important objectives without growth, because I wanted to undermine the growth test. Having said all that, if my own personal view is that whilst we need all of the efficiency gains that we can get and through whatever mechanism you propose, we need them that much more the faster the economy is growing. It's just a question of arithmetic. Double the size of the economy, you've got to have double the efficiency just to stand still. So if you want to do more than stand still, if you've doubled the size of the economy, you've got to do better than double the efficiency. And if you triple the size of the economy, so it gets worse. So I would actually put it back to the, because you want a question. I think it's more of a challenge. The difficulty I had with a number of the comments was that I don't think the predicament that we're in is being taken seriously enough. And when I hear, what are really very piecemeal proposals, marginal adjustments, I don't think you've grasped the seriousness of our predicament. And I think you really have to take a step back and look at the state of the world, look at what the science is telling us, look at the increasing population, look at the kind of problems Carlo mentioned. These are much bigger than the Clean Air Act of 1970 was ever intended to deal with. We've got to, I think, raise our game and think on that scale. I'd really like to get something more from the panelists that try to do that.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm going to take this lady on the side here.
Yes, thank you. My name's Camilla Toulmin. I'm at a think tank based in London called IIED. I wanted to link back to a couple of the sessions we had this morning where we looked at the climate and governance, the global commons, and we also looked at the finance sector. And in both of those cases, as we've heard this afternoon, a big part of the problem of us not moving ahead in the right direction is the fact that there are very powerful interests in both the energy sector and in the banking and finance who have got their fingers deeply into, if this isn't a mixed metaphor, the entrails of government. What are we going to do to get those fingers out and to get new thinking and a different direction taken by our political masters? I don't see any way in which that's being taken seriously. And with the super PACs in the US, you're kind of driving very fast in the opposite direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard?
Well, in this wonderful display, I think, old and new thinking about the environment and economy, one thing really caught my attention, which was Cameron's description of the unbounded nature of the intellectual economy. It reminded me of the German philosopher Herder's view that imagination is limitless, something without resource constraints, you might say. Or as McGilchrist put it, there are more potential link connections in the human brain than there are particles in the universe. So this is clearly a great source of hope. But my question is it not also a great problem in narrative terms for dealing with the problem? It seems to me that at some level, the general population often takes the view that there's no need to make artificial sacrifices now because human ingenuity will ensure that something turns up just in time.
I'm going to take just a couple more questions because we are running up against the resource constraint of time, and then we'll do one last round with the panel. This gentleman here in the front.
Yes, like others, I really appreciated this panel, but of course, if I just confine myself to statements of praise, it won't be interesting. So let me pick a bone, and unfortunately, I will pick on Seth, who I really liked your presentation in so many ways, and I know you've heard this debate before, but I think it's extremely important, so I want to bring it up now, and that is, I think it's a profound political as well as economic mistake to see carbon revenues as a source of money for the state, for transition, for ecological programs. This is a long story, but I will just to list things as quickly as I can. Number one, and most important, a huge political barrier, not the only, but a very huge one, is that politicians are terrified of asking their constituencies to pay more money for energy because people don't want to pay more money for energy, and they're afraid they will lose their jobs. So to return the money to the public is politically critical. On top of that, and being very quick, carbon taxes, carbon revenues are highly regressive, number one. Number two, there's no guarantee we're going to control that money. We can't control the money that's already there. Number three, if we're going to fight for that money, why don't we fight for the money that's already there?
Thank you. Is it a gentleman in the back? Yes, you. If you could wait for the microphone to come back, because this is all being recorded for posterity. Yeah, should posterity still exist? Yeah. Right.
Felix Kreuzig, Technical University Berlin, Climate Change Economics. I cut down my 5 points to 2 in a number of times. First, I heard for the how question, I heard 2 strategies. One was carbon pricing. The other one was Hal's point of number of policy strategies for consumer products and machines, etc. I would argue that the third dimension, an intermediate dimension, which is infrastructures and spatial structures, which is on an intermediate scale, where in the long run, by having these infrastructure investments, and you mentioned number of 6 trillion there, you actually induce a lot of emissions, or you don't induce, and this is another policy area where you can actually add. And the second point is to Cameron's talk. The question boils really down, can you substitute material intensity with intellectual intensity? And your main conceptual idea, which I heard, was that you have this positive spillovers, for example, because of people are coming together. And I'm coming a lot from urban economics, so I'm thinking about cities, that is where people coming together. And actually, yes, you see, cities are so much more efficient because of this intellectual neighborhood, but also this efficiency, this increases phase transition, additional carbon productivity gains is actually raised by having additional GDP growth, because it's even so much more productive. So I would like you to comment on that point.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I'm going to now go back to the panel because we're actually a bit over time. So I'm going to ask the panel to do a lightning round, and this will be a test of being able to take these huge, rich, and complex issues and boil them down to a couple of quick responses.
Right. And I won't try to answer all of the questions. To Peter, I will just say yes. It needs to be bold and set bold targets on stabilizing material throughput. But really, it's about redefining the good life and about just banishing GDP from as a political evaluation. Right? That's my main point. We shouldn't judge governments by how they perform on this. To your point about the oil and gas sector, I was trying to be a little provocative when I talked about the need for a crown corporation in the natural gas sector, but here's what I think. We need to seriously step up our game of negotiating with this sector. And even the threat of a crown corporation could serve us very well. This was what happened in Bolivia with Evo Morales and natural gas, right? When he said, we have royalty rates in British Columbia of 10%. It's ridiculous. Evo Morales said it's going to be 80. And the natural gas sector said, well, we're going to leave. And he said, okay, we'll do it ourselves. And they said, we were kidding. That's what I think we need to do with that sector. But to your question, thank you for your praise, but I strongly disagree with needing absolute revenue neutrality on a carbon tax. And I'll tell you, and this is from our experience in British Columbia, where it was presented and it was revenue neutral. All of it turned back, everything that was raised, in tax cuts of different kinds. In fact, it was revenue negative. And it was very cynical, and the public saw it as cynical. In an opinion research that we did, to the extent that the public was aware that it was structured in a revenue neutral way, they thought it was dumb. Why wouldn't we use the money? So when we model a $200 carbon tax, which would raise $8 billion in British Columbia, which is not bad in an economy of $200 billion. What we say is, because you're right, it's regressive, take half of that towards an expanded low-income credit right through the low and modest income range, and take the other half of it and put it to use meeting the challenge. I would just say this finally, and it relates to my very last lesson around the democratic conversation we need to have. That was the BC government's main failing. It never had the conversation. It didn't engage the public. And what I think the lessons out of Brazil and participatory budgeting tell us is that if we give people that chance to deliberate in that fulsome conversation, they change.
Thanks for all of those questions. I'll address Felix and Richards, given that they were kind of explicitly directed at me. Felix, the point you make about cities and increase in scale, I think, is bound to be right. It's a subset of the broader set of rebound effects that you observe in this area. Let's say a couple of things about them. The rebound effects are not necessarily a bad thing. They're bad if the only objective you're interested in is environmental protection, but the fact that you get greater productivity gains and GDP growth and other things going on, people's lives being enriched, that's a good thing. So the challenge that we have is to deal with the fact that expanding our intellectual economy and injecting more human intelligence into the production process both gives us more efficiency and potentially leads to a scale effect. The challenge is to cap the scale effect. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that we've got hundreds of years worth of evidence that we can do this, and we don't. And I'm certainly not underestimating the scale of the challenge or the seriousness of it. My point is just that we need a massive structural break anyway. So something major has to change. And for my money, the thing that is major and that needs to change is about capping that environmental impact while allowing technology, innovation, intellectual activity to flourish so we can actually achieve the goals that we need to achieve, rather than kind of capping growth. Richard, on your point of sacrifice, it's probably a failure of communication on my part. I certainly think we're in dangerous territory if the message that gets out is that there's no cost. Now, probably other people on the panel disagree with me, but I think what the Stern Review did was to say this is not necessarily going to be free. It might be free. There's some scenarios where actually we unleash a new wave of innovation and it's all fantastic, but it could cost us, and it could cost us a fair whack. So just get ready for it, because we need to do it anyway. And the political communication of that message, I think, is smarter and more robust than the communication that says this is all going to be free, and then several years later, actually we're going to spend 100 billion quid on offshore wind farms, and your bills are going to go up a lot. Sorry about that. So I think that the comms are very important. I mean, overall, I think there is scope for new economic thinking here. Gernot's right that old economic thinking does get us a fair bit of the way, but in addressing both the political and the technological challenges, complexity economics and new modes of economics do have a lot to say, and actually that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm really impressed by the intensity of the conversation that was nearly starting, but given time constraint couldn't start now. I will be around. I hope that there will be scope right now to keep talking. I saw the hand of Alan Kerman. I just want to sing his praise, because there's few people from whom I learned more about economics than from Alan. I certainly want to hear what you want to say later, over coffee, whatever, doesn't matter. But there is not only fun, but also a need for a real new kind of intense, shared conversation and thinking and research about these problems. We are by no means through, and just among ourselves, among the scholars, we need to find instruments to carry that conversation forward. I'm really not in the business of making propaganda. I see this as a part of community service. With Diana Mangaraju is sitting out there. We are just launching a journal, Complexity Economics, with Balzers. If some other platform works better, no problem with me, But I can tell you that Econometrica is not going to be the place where the new ideas will develop. We will have to take over Econometrica, but this takes a moment, and in the meantime, we need some platforms, we need some tools. So much about the conversation among ourselves. But in my professional life, one of the most important things was when I got really engaged with practitioners who were interested in these questions. And when I moved into the kind of dialogue where the other side knew more than me on many important things, and I knew more than them on many important things, and they listened and I listened. And that kind of conversation is still very hard to achieve, but for instance, just 10 days from now, I'm not going to mention too many names, but some of the people in this room will sit together with reasonably high-level people from German government to discuss some of these questions. Not in the mode of we all agree, not in the mode of it's clear what we will do, but in the mode of if we don't develop some new ideas about how to proceed, then we are really, really in trouble. And I want to finish by saying that for me, INET is a huge hope as a community that can address these things. I spent last winter in USA. I think I understand that one of the few legal things the Fed can do to really get the American economy going would be to buy security-backed, mortgage-backed securities. This could be linked to energy efficiency measures. You're talking about more than $1 trillion. You're talking about more than 2% reduction of unemployment. It's not me who has done this. It's people in America. And I have no intention to do in America that kind of study, but I have all the intention of the world to work with people who do it. I'll spend fall in China, 3 months, with exactly the same intent. In economics, there have been massive innovations. How do you call it in America? Okay. It was a Franciscan monk in Italy who centuries ago invented it. It changed the world. Paper money. It's changed the world. We continue to imagine that we will solve those gigantic problems with the tools that we know today. We will not. You can be sure. Looking back from 2100, there will be huge institutional innovations. And it's our responsibility to help to develop them. And I see INET as a fantastic breeding ground for this.
Perhaps one institutional innovation, or I guess sort of a policy with probably the biggest environmental impact of anything I could imagine, is basically a twofer: campaign finance reform in the US and term limits in Congress. Right? Now, clearly that's not something that the 5 of us would be working on, but in a sense, that probably is the one policy with probably the biggest ripple effects you could imagine. Short of that, it turns out, the biggest single policy step the US has ever taken to decrease its emissions was in fact the ratcheting down of CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards for vehicles under President Obama now. So clearly it is, if not in all of the above, which is what Obama's latest energy campaign slogan is, it is at least in most of the above that we need to take into account. I just want to end on one, I guess, possibly hopeful note. Page 1 of the comprehensive climate bill that passed the House of Representatives but failed in the Senate in the US 2 years ago mentioned India and China, essentially saying, unless they act, we won't. That was pretty much the language. While it turns out China, as part of its 12th five-year plan, is implementing 7 regional cap-and-trade systems. India has a coal tax. It's $1 a ton of coal, but still, it's there. It's raising $500 million a year. It's being used to invest in renewable energy. Australia, despite enormous opposition, just passed a price on CO2 turning into a cap-and-trade system in 3 years. New Zealand has a cap-and-trade system, an absolute cap on emissions. Brazil has a national target, not just for deforestation, for overall Brazilian CO2 emissions. Costa Rica is another infamous example, going carbon neutral by, I believe, 2021. I don't know why not 2020, but couldn't quite make it by then. So it's example after example. Right? China, India, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Right? Does it all add up to enough? No, clearly not. We clearly need to raise our game. But it is, in fact, the case that, well, other than in Washington, we are looking at enormous movement, and actually even in the US, right? Sacramento, California, by some measures the 8th or 9th largest economy on the planet, essentially passed the most comprehensive cap and trade system of anyone. And the most ambitious at that too, with long-term targets, longer-term targets than the EU has in place at the moment. So, not sure that's a too hopeful message, but at least there is a lot happening. Well, does the US have to step up to the plate? Sooner rather than later, yes, but then I guess for the most part it is in fact the non-environmental policy, the campaign finance reform, the term limits or whatever else essentially takes money out of politics that will make the biggest difference here.
Thank you. Thank you. What I thought I'd do is focus very quickly on the two questions. Are we doing enough, and is it fast enough? The speed question, the seriousness question, and then what about the politics? How do we win the politics? Building on some of your points, I recently put out a paper called "Costs of Delay," and it's absolutely frightening to do carbon math and do it seriously. I argue in this paper, having looked at the cost of delay, that if we go business as usual, it will not be possible to stabilize. It'll be much more costly, let me rephrase that, to stabilize at 650 than it would be at 450. Much more costly, because we will create another 2 generations of embedded infrastructure that we have to disassemble. So anyway, if you go to energyinnovation.org and look at the publications page, you will get that. It is much more serious. So how do we get there quickly? We focus on the stuff that matters. We look at what works, and we do the math. And I argue there's 10 policies that matter, and there are 10 countries that matter. And you get about 80% of what you need to out of that. So let's go get those things done. We don't have to invent all new stuff. Every one of these policies has been proved somewhere. They can be made better, but nobody's adopted them all. And there's a paper called Policies That Work on that same website, which you can read. So how about the politics? And this gets kind of interesting. There's a phenomenon which I'll call the virtuous cycle. If you phrased the question about the people that have their fingers in the entrails of the government, those are called vested interests, and they know where to squeeze and how hard to get what they want. The new interests, clean energy, for example, by definition, don't have these deep vested political strengths. And so you can't beat something with nothing, or it's hard. So what you need to do is start with stuff you can get and use that to build an economic constituency and therefore a political constituency. And you see when this happens, it spirals. So when Jerry Brown was governor of California the first time, he put these building codes into place, and he put new utility regs into place, and he put appliance standards into place. And industries sprung up, and people went to work, and the builders learned how to do that, and the glass manufacturers made new stuff. And so through a series of governors since then, progressive and regressive, Republican and Democratic, that momentum has never faltered. It's accelerated at times more than at others. That's a virtuous cycle. The law of momentum is when you get some, go get some more. Do not relax. So where's that going to come from in the first instance? It's going to come from the lighthouse countries, Germany. It's essential that Germany come up with a spectacular, practical plan and implement it to become the first modern low-carbon economy. South Korea, Japan, California, those countries will demonstrate a new kind of prosperity, and the others will dumbly, slowly, maybe fall along behind. The biggest lighthouse of all could be China. Their 12 5-year plan is dramatic, but they're in an absolute horse race between that and their traditional economic race, and we don't know how it's going to come out. So, thank you.
We are now beyond the safe operating space of our time, and I apologize to all the people who wanted to ask questions but didn't, but echoing Carlo, I think we were just getting warmed up, and this is a conversation that I very much expect to continue both through INET and I'm sure other forums, and I just want to first thank the audience for staying awake at the end of a very long conference and for asking such thoughtful questions, and then most of all I'd like to thank our panelists for their very thought-provoking presentations. Thank you.